United States Force Southern Unit. Lincoln was his horse was stolen nearby, and he was also alleged to have lost something. And so this was local history that I became interested in the same way most people get interested in local history. And then as I proceeded through what began as a military career and then turned into a military academic career and then eventually an academic career, I needed to find things to research, to write theses and write papers and so forth. And so I got interested in the Blackhawk War again, but the nature of my inquiry sort of changed over time, and I became much more interested in this topic from a Native American perspective. And I cannot pretend to present to you a Native American perspective, let alone a Native American perspective from the 1830s or periods previously. But to the extent that I am able, I'm going to try to give you an empathetic understanding of why Native peoples became involved in European wars over roughly 400 years of North American history. Don't get worried, I have only 45 minutes, so I say I'm going to cover 400 years. I'm going to cover it very, very quickly. So it is my pleasure, it's my honor to speak here at the Portage Indian Agency House and to close out this speaker series. This evening I'm going to talk a little bit about the Blackhawk War, like I indicated, but I'm going to do so in the broader context of Native American participation in European wars. This was nearly a ubiquitous phenomenon over these 400 years that I'm talking about. Yet it remains very poorly understood, and in some quarters, something that people aren't really comfortable talking about. People suffer from grave misperceptions about Indian participation in European wars, particularly as Americans broadly came to sympathize with Native Americans in the last quarter of the 20th century. We simultaneously fell victim to dangerous stereotypes about Indians, their enemies, and their allies. However well-intentioned, there are popular books and motion pictures that have suggested to us that Indians come in two general varieties. Resistance fighters, heroic resistance fighters that is, and villainous opportunists, willing to sell out their fellow Indians by cooperating with the United States or by other white European powers. Thus, Eldon Joseph's popular 1961 book, The Patriot Chiefs, bestows this honorific title on the likes of Tecumseh, Osceola, and Blackhawk, while deliberately denying it to their rivals, Blackhoof, Apotle Yaholo, and Keokuk. In Joseph's idealized rendition of the past, only those who resisted American expansion by force of arms were worthy of veneration and celebration. Conversely, Indian leaders who chose other ways to look after the best interests of their people as they saw them became objects of scorn, perhaps even more contemptible than the Americans that they tried to accommodate. A more recent, and probably to most of you more familiar, example of this phenomenon may be found in the film Dances with Wolves, in which the noble Lakota are contrasted with the vile Pawnees. Every wanton act of violence perpetrated by Indians in that movie comes at the hand of the Pawnees, who, not coincidentally, are military allies of the United States. Throughout the film, the Pawnees are portrayed as barbarous and treacherous people. At the very end of the film, they're permitted to add incompetent to their resume when it ends with a Pawnee scout wearing a blue U.S. Army jacket, shrugging his shoulders with an insipid smile on his face when he loses the trail of the Lakota camp. So that's the way that the Pawnees come off. Treacherous and probably not very bright on top of it. We might excuse the Pawnees if they were less than pleased with this depiction of their people. But in fairness to the filmmakers, it merely reflected a much broader proclivity in modern American society, native or otherwise, to ascribe virtue to those Indians who fought against Europeans and treachery to those who fought beside them. Well, doing this has a certain poetic appeal, I suppose. It does not hold up very well to historical scrutiny. And it compels Native American communities today to selectively remember or forget broad swaths of their own history. Just as many Anglo-Americans today fancy the idea that they are daughters or sons of the American Revolution, while denying the fact that Tory blood probably also courses through their veins, many Indians today would just as soon think that all of their answers were patriot chiefs who fought the good fight. I'm here tonight to say they're right. That is the case. But I would also point out that in 1675, in 1759, in 1832, and in 1880, the good fight was oftentimes against other Indians, and just as often with a powerful European ally by their side. And that the chiefs who helped orchestrate these alliances were no less patriotic than those celebrated by Alvin Josephy. What's more, this kind of military cooperation was far more common than Americans today realize, and in some instances care to admit. A particularly relevant case in point, particularly as we are gathered here this evening at the Portage Indian Agency House, is the Blackhawk War. Nearly all popular depictions of this conflict cast it as a red against white war, in which a heroic but doomed band of Sauk and Meskwaki Indians makes a last desperate bid to maintain some of their autonomy in the face of overbearing white expansion. How then can we explain the fact that more than 700 Indian warriors allied with the United States in this war against Blackhawk, who at his peak commanded certainly no more than 500 of his own warriors? From the perspective afforded to us by Alvin Josephy and the movie Dances with Wolves, there's only a handful of possible explanations for this phenomenon. As the Blackhawk War occurred only 2 years after the passage of the Indian Removal Act, their conduct appears in hindsight to have been at best foolhardy and at worst treacherous. Literature about the Blackhawk War has largely concluded as much, describing America's Indian allies during this conflict as mercenaries, guerrilla fighters for their white overlords, and treacherous Indians who betrayed Blackhawk when they should have been his friends. But none of these explanations does justice to the Menominee, Dakota, Ho-Chunk, or Potawatomi communities that allied with the United States. Nor do they help us to understand the almost constant pattern of Indian alliance with European powers over these 400 years of North American history. So what I would like to do with the balance of my time this evening is discuss in very broad strokes this larger phenomenon of Indian participation in European wars, working forward to the Blackhawk War and then a little bit beyond it, and then answering whatever questions you have at the end. The fundamental key to us understanding Native participation in European wars is to abandon the benefit of hindsight. As we stand in the early 21st century and gaze backward, we have a tendency to want to judge historical actors by what we now know, rather than by the light of their individual experiences and circumstances. We must also dispense with the notion that the native inhabitants of North America represented a single people who might have united together to expel their European invaders. Expecting the Iroquois or the Hurons or the Meskwakis and Dakotas to ally together against Europeans makes no more sense than expecting the 18th century British and French to ally with one another against anybody else. They're mortal enemies. And this provides a key to understanding one of the root causes of Indian participation in these wars. It is competition amongst these groups, Indian against Indian and European against European, that provides the earliest and the most enduring motivation for Indian-European alliances. The Spanish conquistadors notwithstanding, most European adventurers who visited North America in the 16th and 17th centuries came as legal rather than military conquerors. Hoping to claim broad swaths of North America by the right of pretended discovery, their principal competition was not the Indians who already lived here, but other colonial enterprises staking their own claims to the continent. In principle, at least, most of the European sovereigns recognized the Indians' right of occupancy on their lands. but they were willing to fight one another for the exclusive right to buy those lands out from the Indians in due course. For their part, the Indians might have scoffed at the notion that the Europeans had discovered anything, but they had various reasons for wanting to cozy up to whatever European power planted its flag nearby. For centuries before the arrival of Christopher Columbus, the Indians of North America had been a trading people, bartering corn for deer meat, wampum beads for copper, and lead for fish. Thus, when European fishermen first appeared off the coast of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland in the 15th century, the Indians living there were quick to extend the hand of commerce, offering pelts and produce in return for European manufactured goods. What looked to them at the time like an equitable deal, however, came at a tremendous hidden cost. European wares came bearing microbes, to which Native Americans had never been exposed and for which they had developed no immunity whatsoever. Thus, well before the time Europeans established an enduring presence on the continent, their diseases presaged their arrival, sweeping before them and exacting a horrific toll from the indigenous population. Well before they had ever seen a white man, most Indians had already seen and handled their desirable trade goods, but had also mourned over loved ones who were laid low by European diseases. Estimates vary wildly, but as much as 90% of North America's pre-contact indigenous population perished in these terrible years. This, however, only made the need for European allies more pressing. Smallpox and other scourges were fickle, wiping out some communities entirely while leaving others virtually unscathed, if only for the time being. Those hit the hardest found themselves at the mercy of their traditional enemies and searching for new ways to cope with their new world. The fledgling European colonies, meanwhile, also worried about how they're going to survive the next winter or perhaps the next raid. Not so much from the Indians in the very early going, but from other Europeans sweeping up and down the Atlantic coast trying to eliminate their colonial competitors. Although I don't want to minimize the incidence of Indian raids, in some cases this is pretty much a military invasion and occupation, but that has become in the American mind the normative mode of conduct. And that is not the case up and down the East Coast at the very beginning of this story. Under these circumstances, it's not surprising to us that Native Americans and Europeans would seek economic and military security by joining their joint interests together. In the early years of English colonization, Indians who enjoyed such a relationship were fortunate, for they conveyed tremendous economic power. As European trade goods became indispensable to Indian life, so too did regular access to a European trading partner. And those in closest proximity wielded influence over the more distant tribes. Of course, a privilege such as this is bound to attract its share of jealousy from the disadvantaged tribes. In 1622, the Pequots of Connecticut enjoyed a favored relationship with the Dutch that made them perhaps the most powerful Indian polity in all of New England. But this did not sit very well, either with the Pequots' unwilling tributary tribes who had to pay taxes to their Pequot overlords, or to the aspiring English neighbors to the east who looked covetously upon Pequot lands. By 1637, these jealous Indians and jealous Englishmen had knocked the Pequots from their perch and pushed them to the brink of extinction, the English going so far as to even outlaw the use of the word Pequot for a number of years to come. The Mohican Indians of New York suffered a similar fate. By virtue of their geography, they profited mightily when the Dutch established Fort Orange at the confluence of the Mohawk and Hudson Rivers, the present-day site of Albany, New York. More interested in furs than in real estate, the Dutch made relatively good allies to the Indians, and the Mohicans prospered while their neighbors grew jealous. Thus, from 1624 to 1628, the Mohawks of the Iroquois Confederacy launched an offensive campaign to drive off the Mohicans, to supplant them and secure for themselves direct access to the Dutch traders at Fort Orange. The Mohawk victory had monumental consequences for the Iroquois, who for the first time found themselves fully engaged in a truly global marketplace. In exchange for animal pelts, especially from the beaver, which suited the fashion demands of Europe of the day, large demand for beaver pelt hats or genuine beaver hats in Europe, in return for those pelts, the Iroquois received guns and other European manufactured goods that gradually but profoundly altered and transformed these indigenous economies. Armed by the Dutch in the 1630s, the Iroquois expanded in all directions in search of new hunting grounds to fuel this new economy, seeking pelts, prisoners to replace their war losses. This is another attribute of Iroquois warfare, in particular, a phenomenon known as the Morning War. As they would suffer casualties, they would try to replace these casualties by going to war again and taking prisoners and then adopting those prisoners into their communities. So they're seeking the pelts, they're seeking prisoners to convert into Iroquois, and they're also, for the men involved in these campaigns, seeking prestige, military honor, and glory, which, as I'll return to repeatedly in the course of this lecture, is the principal way by which young Indian men could earn distinction and advance in their societies. So these expansionary wars in all directions, but as far as we're interested here tonight, principally west, intensified in the 1640s, and they led to attacks against one of the Iroquois' most fundamental enemies, the Hurons, who were critical to France's North American fur trade at this point. By the end of the decade, by the end of the 1640s, the Iroquois were at the height of their military power, and they had scattered the Hurons, who had to take refuge from neighboring tribes. Thereafter, the Iroquois continued their westward offensive, subsuming the nearest tribes and creating a refugee crisis at the far end of the Great Lakes, to include a place we today call Wisconsin. And so I'll briefly point out to you where here the Iroquois reside. The Iroquois essentially live in what is present-day New York. At this time, there are 5 different Iroquois tribes that generally are arrayed from west to east: the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, the Oneida, and the Mohawks. The Mohawks, by being the furthest to the east, closest to the English, actually is good for the Mohawks in the early going. I'm not going to dwell on it too much this evening, but by the time of the American Revolution, the Mohawks do not like living very close to the Europeans, because by this point, they're dealing with Americans who want land more than trade. So proximity is very important here. But these Iroquois here in New York are going to push out in all directions, and they're going to displace large elements of all of these Algonquian populations you see here and push them into Wisconsin. At the dawn of the 1600s, Ojibwas, also known as Chippewas, Menominees, and Ho-Chunks, who are here depicted on this map as Winnebagos, called Wisconsin their home. They were joined soon afterward by the Foxes, also known as the Meskwakis, who were chased out of their Michigan homelands by eastern bands of Ojibwas. In Wisconsin, they lived peaceably beside their new Menominee and Ho-Chunk neighbors until the mid-17th century, when these refugees from Iroquoian expansion flooded Wisconsin. They soon overburdened the region's natural resources and pushed both the Menominees and the Ho-Chunks toward the brink of extinction. To turn back this Iroquois menace and to restore balance to their world, these tribes needed a European partner capable of offsetting the Iroquois advantage in access to European trade goods, most principally guns and gunpowder, through first the Dutch and then later the English at Albany. New France, meanwhile, hoped to tap the lucrative fur trade of the western Great Lakes, but it desperately needed Indian allies to help offset the endemic weaknesses of this colonial enterprise that was New France. Foremost among them being the fact that it did not have its own force of reliable manpower. It was not a naturally reproducing settler colony, and on a related note, it was not self-sufficient agriculturally. For it to stay afloat, it needed to have food goods imported constantly from elsewhere in North America or from Europe. So New France, to an even greater extent than the English, needs these Indian allies because it doesn't have enough actual Frenchmen in North America to make good its claims to almost all of the continent. Now, while it would be misleading to depict this French and Indian alliance as a match made in heaven, it was the next best thing, which is to say it was a match made in Wisconsin. Because this alliance was predicated on genuine interdependencies, in other words, all parties of the alliance really needed one another, and they could not harm their enemy, or rather their allies' interests, without harming their own, it established a remarkable precedent for Indian-European cooperation and collaboration. Again, I want to be careful not to overstate the harmony of this alliance, for like many marriages, it was marked by its share of rocky periods, disappointments, and occasionally even betrayals. Moreover, as the Meskwakis learned when they figuratively rocked King Louis's fur-laden boats, the French could become very, very bitter enemies, indeed near genocidal, when pushed to anger. Nevertheless, the French remained dependent upon the Indians for both warriors and hunters. And this is an important point here. Both of those roles require the Indians to remain masters of their lands. This is an important distinction between New France and New England and the other English colonies, is that for most of this contest, the French need the Indians to be Indians, and they need them to be Indians in possession of their own lands. That increasingly becomes less the case when it comes to the British colonies in North America. Those British colonies, by the way, successfully evicted the Dutch from North America in the 1660s and 1670s, and they took over Fort Orange, renaming it Albany and replacing the Dutch as the Iroquois Confederacy's principal European ally. Although the Iroquois sat astride most of the major riverine trade routes in that part of the country, in other words, this is strategically important terrain, very valuable real estate in a strategic sense, the Iroquois were just far enough from the English settler colonies that they were able to, for many generations, enjoy most of the benefits, but very few of the costs of being allies of the English. The biggest thing that the English had going for them when it came to Indian alliances was their trade goods, which were at once superior to and cheaper than French wares. But alliance with the English colonies came at a tremendous cost as well. So long as their Indian allies had pelts to trade or common enemies to fight, the relationship remained mutually beneficial. But as either of these commodities diminished, pelts or enemies, it altered the balance of this relationship. And most Indians had little recourse eventually but to trade the one commodity that they had plenty of, at least in the early going, and that, of course, is land. Indeed, land was the alpha and the omega of all Indian-English relations, as it would later become the alpha and the omega of all U.S.-Indian relations. This certainly did not work to the Indians' long-term advantage. Formerly indispensable allies, such as the Wampanoags, the Delawares, the Susquehannocks, the Tuscaroras, the Yamasees, watched both their land base and their sovereignty gradually slip out of their grasp. Betrayed by their erstwhile allies, these tribes and many, many others gradually transformed from allies to victims to enemies. And it's not a coincidence that a lot of these named Indian wars from early English colonial history, the names of those wars, those were the English enemies. Most of those tribes had been allies of some English colonies before they were enemies of others, or sometimes the same ones. Nevertheless, a European sponsor was nearly indispensable to most Indian communities by the 18th century. Geography, as I've already indicated, largely dictated to the Indians their choice of allies. Those in the western Great Lakes necessarily allied with the French, who controlled everything that's depicted here. I shouldn't say controlled. They laid claim to, a relatively effective claim to everything here depicted in blue, whereas this salmon color here depicts British colonies, yellow Spanish possessions, and then this cross-hatched area is the all-important contested zone. Those tribes along the Appalachians availed themselves of the fruits of British industry, which, remember I pointed out, were generally better than and less expensive than French manufactured goods. Elsewhere, the Indians could capitalize on the proximity of competing European colonies to maintain relative autonomy. In the South, for instance, the Choctaws of Mississippi could not only shop their trade goods and their military potential to the French or to the British, but they could also go into Florida and try to cut a deal with the Spaniards and play each of these sides off of one another. Similarly, in 1701, the Iroquois declared their neutrality in all future wars between France and Britain in North America, and afterwards served as the fulcrum upon which the European contest between these two powers was going to pivot. Beyond the Allegheny Mountains, meanwhile, the victims of English land hunger of a previous generation took up residence beside tribes who welcomed European trade goods, but were well happy and content to leave Europeans themselves beyond the mountains and at arm's length. So long as France, Britain, and Spain contested one another for control of the continent, Native American communities were able to exploit what is called the playoff system to retain their autonomy even as they had already become economically dependent upon European powers. But this system, the playoff system, shattered in the wake of the 7 Years' War in North America, also called the French and Indian War. There were 3 previous big showdowns between France and Britain in North America, and in each of them, New France had been able to compensate for its many, many disadvantages by its remarkable Indian alliance. As I like to tell my students, this alliance was the life raft that kept New France afloat. Thus, when in the 1740s, the British started sending traders in force across the Appalachians and into this contested zone, into the Ohio country, it risked tearing a gaping hole in this life raft. For those British traders were coming with these better and cheaper trade goods and putting them within reach of France's Western Indian allies. To make a common day sort of analogy, France is the mom and pop store and Walmart is coming to town. And France cannot abide by that because this colony, even by this point, really is no longer profitable. This is more a contest of imperial ambition. France has been willing to run in the red, bleeding money, hemorrhaging money in North America for no other reason than to maintain the glory of the crown and to contest British claims to the continent. And so the French cannot abide by this. These were desperate, desperate times for the French, who responded first by sending raiding parties of sometimes Frenchmen, mostly with Indians, sometimes with French liaisons, to sack and raid these British fur trading posts. And when that didn't do the trick, they actually began to construct fixed fortifications, both in the Ohio country, here in the contested zone, and then also coming down from Canada along the Richelieu, Lake Champlain, Hudson River corridor. Under the circumstances, these were probably strategically prudent moves by the French. Like I said, they really were strategically disadvantaged, and they had to do something. Unfortunately, by building these fixed fortifications in land claimed by the British, they were inviting the kind of conventional war that the French and their Indian allies were ill-equipped to win in North America. And so France and their Indian allies went on to lose the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War in North America. At the Treaty of Paris in 1763, the French relinquished their North American claims, but the war's biggest losers by far were the continent's native inhabitants, who lost either a very valuable ally or, at a minimum, the ability to play one European power off of another and thus maintain some autonomy even while sliding into economic dependence. Fortunately for the Indians, the playoff system caught a second wind when the American colonists began to resent British rule. By 1775, the playoff system had largely been resurrected, this time with the British reprising the role of the French to include geographically, they're in Canada and in military posts out in the West, and now the American colonists continue on with the English tradition to include the hunger for land that complicates their ability to find Indian allies, even when they want them. So, as with the previous system, the better ally from an Indian perspective is usually the weaker ally, the one that has genuine dependencies and cannot get along without its Indian trading partners and military allies. In the second playoff system, that's Great Britain, again reprising the role previously held by the French. This new contest between the former British colonies and the British Crown outlasted the American Revolution, as the British continued to occupy those western military posts, to include those in Wisconsin, the western Great Lakes, what was then called the Old Northwest, and the British also there continued to dominate the fur trade among the Indians. Throughout this period, the British practiced a brand of Indian diplomacy that was nearly perfected by the French and their Indian allies the generation before them. Once again, important point worth reiterating, mutual dependence made for a good alliance. However, the British were not always very good allies to the Indians. The Indians started to get a whiff of this at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, when the Indians contested the American intrusion into the Ohio country, lost a tactical battle, ran back to their British allies to seek shelter in a fort, and had the British commandant there shutter the gate and make the Indians endure a second tactical defeat outside the gates. Not a very good ally. That was going to come to full, that was going to be realized even more fully by the end of the War of 1812. This is when the playoff system truly dies, or at least the second version of it, because at the end of that conflict, and negotiations at the Treaty of Ghent, negotiations for the Treaty of Ghent, the British ultimately and conclusively abandoned their Indian allies. It's not to say that they didn't make an effort. Actually, this was one of the things that was on the table that they were bartering for. The British initially made all kinds of demands that they frankly put there in good faith to look after their allies, to whom they'd made promises. But the Americans weren't going to buy it, and the British were not going to sacrifice peace for the sake of Indians. And so by the end of those peace negotiations, the Indians were left completely hung out to dry by their British allies. Insofar as the War of 1812 was in its origins a conflict over Atlantic shipping rights, and only incidentally about Indians, it was technically a tie. In terms of what James Madison was asking Congress to declare war for, not a single one of the British transgressions on the Atlantic was actually addressed in the Treaty of Ghent. It was a clear tie. Americans like to remember it as an American victory, but it was only an American victory in one regard, and it had nothing to do with Britain, it had to do with the Indians. It is a war with no winners and one huge group of losers, those being the native inhabitants of North America. This war had decisive results in the western Great Lakes, where the British at long last relinquished their western trading posts and their control over the fur trade in the region, which the Americans had claimed, at least on paper, since 1783, but it's not until the end of the War of 1812 and 1816 when Americans are finally actually able to make good on this claim. When the Americans entered the region in 1816, they did so as a military force. And when they came into the country, they came raising a sword in one hand, but offering treaties of peace and friendship in the other hand. Disgusted that the British had abandoned them and in need of a new trading partner, most Indian groups in the Old Northwest signed the treaties and kissed the sword rather than risk finding themselves beneath that sword and without a trading partner. For most Indian groups in the region, this was not as difficult as you might imagine. Unlike the Delawares, the Shawnees, the Cherokees, and other eastern tribes, the Indians of this part of what is today the United States had not known the bitter brand of race war that had scarred the Appalachian frontier. For 200 years, the Indians from this part of North America had known white allies with whom they had made war against common foes, both Indian and European. And while Tecumseh's message of pan-Indian unity gained some adherents in Illinois and in the southern parts of the Old Northwest, it had far less currency in the more remote reaches of northern Wisconsin and Minnesota. Moreover, the Americans behaved in a manner that, partly by accident, partly by design, suggested to the Indians tremendous continuity. In treaty councils, such as that shown in here, the Treaty of Prairie du Chien in 1825, Army officers and federal Indian agents employed a paternalistic language of alliance that was very familiar to the Indians. Just as French and British diplomats had spoken on behalf of their ostensibly benevolent and loving kings, American officials negotiated on behalf of the Great Father, the President, who promised economic prosperity and military security to his loyal children. Now, later-day observers oftentimes get confused by this paternalistic language. You know, father, children, it clearly suggests a subordination. To help balance that, though, a little bit, it's helpful to think about familial relationships in many Native communities. And in a lot of Native communities, the father figure was in what Anglo society would regard to be the uncle figure, the kindly guy that shows up with presents and takes you on fun trips. Whereas it's one of mom's brothers, an uncle, who is the disciplinarian, the stern one, the one who commands obedience and respect. And so this paternalistic language, when the Indians participate in it, that does not convey necessarily the sense that they are willingly subordinating themselves as children to a father figure. They are at the same time obligating that father figure. Well, if you're going to be the father, that means you owe me, you've got a lot of goods. You're wealthy, I'm poor, you're the father. That means that if everything you say is true, you need to open the coffers and start filling my pockets. And the moment you stop doing that, you're not really a father anymore, are you? Also, these negotiations took place in a distinctly military setting. You can see that here in this treaty painting. This was intended at first to cow the Indians into submission. Coming in after the War of 1812, a region full of hostile Indians, we're going to walk in with blue coats and cannon and stuff, and we're going to show them who the boss of this region is. But it soon became apparent to many Army officers that these martial displays didn't terrorize the Indians, they delighted the Indians. According to General Edmund Gaines, who was commander of the Western Department during the Blackhawk War, such displays appealed to the Indians' chivalric spirit. Indeed, the pomp and circumstance of treaty proceedings and formal councils suggested to many Indians that the Americans were indeed military allies worth having. A powerful military force walks into my country and says, I want to be your ally and your trading partner. From their perspective and their experience, they'd had two such trading partners in the past. Of course, they're going to take the third one that comes in. Away from the treaty grounds, American officers did other things that resonated with the Indians' conception of alliance. White women, as you might imagine, were exceedingly sparse in the region at the time, Julia Kinsey notwithstanding, and officers routinely took Indian consorts. At one time, all but 2 of the officers at Fort Snelling, Minnesota, had common-law Indian wives. Far from objectionable in Native communities, these marriages effected the most durable and significant bonds of alliance, those of blood, of kinship, which mattered more in Indian alliances than anything else. Charged with enforcing the Trade and Intercourse Acts, the laws that govern all Anglo-American and Indian interaction, these American officials gave Native leaders other reasons to believe the Great Father's professions of love and justice. Generally thinking that the Indians were, in the words of one officer, more sinned against than sinning, the Army ruthlessly enforced the provisions of this law, which aimed to keep white squatters and whiskey peddlers off of Indian lands in the name of security. Consensus view in Washington at the end of every major war is it's cheaper to keep the Indians happy and treat them fairly than it is to fight in an Indian war. The problem is that consensus gets a little bit weaker with the passage of time, which is why there's sort of a generational aspect to these Indian wars. And every time they learn the errors of their ways, but then there's a new administration, a new bunch of congressmen, a new generation of Army officers, and they learn these lessons over and over again. But in the wake of the War of 1812, that's the lesson. It's cheaper to maintain the peace by dealing with the Indians fairly and keeping offensive whites well away from them. Indeed, these frontier whites frequently complained that the Army was prejudiced against them. Some people will say, what is wrong with our Indian Department? This is ridiculous that we have agents of the federal government taking the Indian sides 7 times out of 10 at our expense. And a lot of these frontier whites hauled Army officers off to civil court repeatedly and subjected them to trial for faithfully enforcing the provisions of the Trade and Intercourse Act. The people who were actually hearing the trial were, of course, partisan, not on behalf of the Army officers, but rather on behalf of local interests, and Congress was continually memorialized to help pay the legal expenses of these officers who were being hauled into court for enforcing federal law. Meanwhile, many federal officials were sensitive to Indian notions of justice. In Green Bay, a drunken soldier once grabbed the notable Menominee chief, stabbed the notable Menominee chief Pogana in the thigh with a bayonet. Pogana grabbed this soldier by the neck, threw him to the ground, cursed him for a dog, said he would kill him if he wasn't a U.S. soldier. The commander of Fort Howard in Green Bay afterward had no problem whatsoever with what Pogana had done, but he had that soldier marched out into the public square and had a bunch of Indians assembled to watch him get flogged for his actions, as a clear indication to the Indians that these professions of justice were going to be upheld. Indeed, in the first decade of American occupation from 1816 forward, little suggested to the Indians of this region that the Great Father reserved any kind of special treatment for his white children. Those white children in the region concluded just the opposite, that the Great Father was reserving special treatment for his red ones. But if the Americans were talking the talk of alliance, their walk was at this point a little bit ungainly. Whereas the French and the British had depended upon the Indians of the western Great Lakes to provide both animal pelts and warriors, the Americans were only marginally interested in the former and not in the least interested in the latter. Instead, the Americans urged the Indians to abandon the hunt in favor of agriculture. Now, the idea here was that agriculture required less land than hunting. And if the government could induce these hunters to go to small plot farming, well, that's going to clear up all kinds of surplus lands for development and settlement. The problem in this region, and in many others, was that in the gender spheres of these societies, farming was quintessentially women's work. And the civilization program was basically telling men to surrender part of what made them men, and in its place, pick up something that was part of what made women women. Worse yet, although American military officers venerated the established Indian warriors in council meetings, who got the most respect from the Indian side? Well, of course, it's the most established warriors, the most accomplished war leaders. Those are the people that get respect. But the Americans simultaneously forbid any kind of intertribal conflict whatsoever, instead insisting that the Indians submit to the Great Father to adjudicate all intertribal disputes, and in essence, closing the door to many young men any prospect of social advancement or distinguishing themselves. In essence, this civilization program, which was the official government policy at the time, required that Indian men abandon the very pursuits that made them men. It didn't really matter, however, as American prohibitions against intertribal warfare proved grossly ineffective. Intertribal antagonisms in the region ran deep in the first place, and they only intensified over the 1820s as overhunting led to renewed hostility. The real clash area here for overhunting, the fissure line between Ojibwas and Dakotas, that's one persistent conflict in the region, an Ojibwa against Dakota war, and the other fissure line down here between the Saukes and Meskwakis and the Dakotas. That fissure line does not look like it's between those tribes, but that is contested hunting area between the Dakotas on one hand and the Saukes and Meskwakis on the other hand. The Saukes and Meskwakis, as I pointed out, were immigrants to the region. Meskwakis driven in by the Ojibwas, the Saukes driven in partly by the Iroquois. By the time of the Blackhawk War, they had already worn out their welcome with the indigenous tribes of Wisconsin and had taken up residence down along the banks of the Mississippi between present-day Iowa and present-day Illinois. As game grew sparser in the region, the tensions between these tribes lifted. And that's the critical alliance system here. Saukes and Meskwakis on one hand, Menominees, Dakotas, and certain Ho-Chunks, not all Ho-Chunks, certain Ho-Chunks allied on the other hand. Complicating matters further, white lead miners flooded the region in the late 1820s. This is the lead mining region, that's the other flashpoint, abusing the native population and provoking a war with the Ho-Chunks in 1827. The following year, these miners and men like them elected one of their own to the presidency in Andrew Jackson, with doleful consequences for the security of the upper Mississippi. For over a decade at this point, Army officers and officials in the War Department's Indian Office had labored to cultivate friendly relations with the region's Indians, developing loyalties and sympathies that seemed to transcend race. Indeed, it's a common phenomenon that when there are cries from the frontier about Indian depredations, the assigned Indian agents for the tribes alleged to have committed those depredations almost uniformly always jump to the defense of their Indians. It wasn't my Indians, of course not. It must be somebody else's Indians. And they develop these bonds and they make promises, and there is a legitimate alliance. To the Indians' great misfortune, they're going to eventually learn that their alliance, however, is not with the United States, but with low-level functionaries who are not capable of keeping their promises when there's an election and somebody else is in office. This fragile alliance is going to falter further under the weight of white settlement, and it fails altogether when Jackson assumed the presidency. Jackson almost immediately fired every single Indian agent who did not see eye to eye with him when it came to Indian affairs. And I don't think I need to elaborate Jackson's views on Indian affairs. By September of 1831, Jackson had replaced fully half of his 56 agents and sub-agents with unqualified party hacks. In the midst of this upheaval, it's perhaps not surprising that Indian relations took a marked turn for the worse in 1830 and 1831. U.S. efforts to broker an enduring peace in the region between the Sacs and Meskwakis and their various enemies resulted in tragedy on May 5, 1830, when 50 Dakotas and Menominees killed 16 Meskwaki diplomats beckoned to Prairie du Chien by U.S. officials. The Dakotas and the Menominees, of course, believed they had just evened the score. Remember, this is a generational war. To them, the balance book was now even. But the Meskwakis, not surprisingly, begged to differ, and they exacted their own revenge the following summer, killing 25 Menominees, also outside of Prairie du Chien. Initially, the Menominees turned to who? Their American allies for assistance, but none was forthcoming. Instead, American officials insisted that the Menominees let those maddeningly slow cogs of Anglo-American justice turn. When fall came and went without any satisfaction, the Menominees and their Dakota and Ho-Chunk allies spent the winter plotting a retaliatory spring campaign. Hoping to prevent the eruption of a general conflict in the region, the War Department, on March 17, 1832, sent orders to General Henry Atkinson at Jefferson Barracks, Missouri, to deploy the available force of regulars there up the Mississippi to do what? Not to stop Blackhawk. Blackhawk has done nothing yet. Blackhawk is still in Iowa. When the Army left to come start the Blackhawk War, it wasn't coming to start the Blackhawk War. It was coming to avert the Menominee War against the Meskwakis and their Sauk allies. That's an important point that's often overlooked. Atkinson was also ordered to arrest the Meskwaki perpetrators of the most recent attack, who happened to take refuge with Blackhawk's British band. And this is where these two relatively distinct wars become intertwined with one another. I am not going to this evening discuss the particulars of the Blackhawk War, which I believe was the subject of Carrie Trask's talk earlier in this speaker series. Instead, I'm going to briefly summarize the motives for the various Indian communities that allied with the United States against Blackhawk. In many ways, the Blackhawk War represents in microcosm the range of circumstances that could help produce military alliances between Native groups and European actors over this broad span of history. The Menominees and Dakotas in this case represent what we might call traditional alliances. That is to say, these tribes continued to regard themselves as sovereign entities, partners rather than subjects of the United States. From their perspective, the question why they allied with the United States against Blackhawk makes no sense whatsoever. Their wars against the Sacs and Meskwakis predated the Americans' wars by a long shot. And it would probably be a fairer question to their minds to ask why the United States, a putative ally of theirs, was so reluctant to let them go make war against their common enemy. That's the question that would have made sense, I think, in 1832. When the Americans finally relented and permitted the Dakotas and Menominees to resume their war, these tribes took full advantage. Not only did they strike a blow against their traditional enemies, but they extracted from the United States the material concessions expected of a wealthy European ally, expected of a great father. And it also permitted their young men to distinguish themselves as warriors. This last point was of no small importance to young Indian men, who, as I already pointed out, could win distinction principally by martial feats, rather. Particularly since there really has not been a venue open to them to do so since the conclusion of the War of 1812. You've got a generation of it's teen angst of a very military sort. But the contributions of the Potawatomis and Ho-Chunks represent a very different kind of alliance. Their young men similarly wanted to get in on this war to prove themselves. The biggest difference, they wanted to get in on this war on the side of Blackhawk and to fight against the Americans. Over the preceding decade, and we're talking about populations principally from southern Wisconsin and northern Illinois and northwestern Indiana, over the preceding decade, these are the populations that had endured the worst aspects of this wave of English settlers coming into the region. And they see here an opportunity, because Blackhawk would welcome, he sends envoys, he would welcome them to his banner. The problem is their leaders know better. Remember in 1827, the Ho-Chunks had already gone to war against the Americans because of offenses in the lead mining region and were very quickly put down. And so this is an inversion of that old saw about an old man's war, a young man's fight. For the Potawatomis and the Ho-Chunks, it's the other way around. It is the young men who wish to go to war. It's a young man's war averted and an old man's peace, an old man's accommodation. It is the elders who realize that's a contest they're probably not going to win. And so rather than let their young men drag them into a war they think they're going to lose, they are going to make an almost purely political alliance with the United States, designed merely to demonstrate loyalty to the Americans and to deflect the oftentimes warranted claims that they were lending secret support to the enemy. Whereas the Dakotas and the Menominees were more than eager to shed the blood of their enemies, the Ho-Chunks and Potawatomis sympathized greatly with Blackhawk and his followers. As was routinely the case when alliance networks pitted Indians against their kith and kin, not just here, because a lot of the Ho-Chunks are intermarried with the Sacs and Meskwakis, but in all of the periods leading up to this and even afterwards, when those alliance networks put Indian friends and Indian family members in the line of fire against one another, they did what they almost always did, and that was pull their punches. Even if it means aiming high, sending envoys forward and telling them, we're coming, we're over here, just so you know, make sure you're shooting high so that we don't spill any of one another's blood. Indeed, during the Blackhawk War, there were Ho-Chunk and Potawatomi scouts ostensibly guiding Atkinson's army for over a month, taking him nowhere, leading him on a wild goose chase, while Ho-Chunk guides were actually escorting the British band to safety. They were playing it at both ends. This is not an uncommon phenomenon. What the Blackhawk War does not really illustrate very well is the third sort of Indian participation in European wars, which is as an auxiliary rather than as an ally. The semantics in this case, I think, are important because the word ally connotes a mutual recognition of sovereignty. An alliance is a partnership between sovereigns. And no matter how uneven the nature of the relationship or the many, many ways in which the Americans qualified Native American sovereignty, the Americans nevertheless, in their early history, treated the Indians in accordance with Indian protocols for international relations, giving them reason to think that these were relationships between sovereigns. After a point, however, both in the broad scheme in terms of the overall fate of all of Native North America, but also for individual polities. So for some groups, for some tribes, this happens much, much earlier. Those from the eastern United States, this might have happened to them in the 16th or the 17th centuries. At some point, the disparity in power in this relationship becomes so great that the European partner gives up the charade of treating their Indian allies like actual allies, like sovereign partners rather than colonial subjects. Well before 1872, when the United States Congress officially abandoned the practice of making treaties with Indians, most Indian communities and individuals had to confront the sad fact of Anglo-American hegemony. Many of these Indians chose to resist it by force, earning the admiration of their descendants and eventually nearly all Americans. It's interesting to note, for instance, that 20 towns, 3 counties, 2 townships, 1 borough, 2 lakes, 2 mountains, a state park, and a national forest bear the name Osceola, an enemy of the United States, venerated. Anybody know who his most effective Anglo-American antagonist was? The most effective American commander in the Second Seminole War. There were 7 of them, by the way. Everybody asked, almost 5 of them asked to be fired. They said, forget this, and they tried to find employment somewhere. The most effective of them all was Thomas Sidney Jessup, who was actually very, very effective as a military commander. His historical legacy? Nothing other than the fact that he captured Osceola under a white flag of truce and stained his honor. So I'm just demonstrating the passage of time has done odd things to American remembrance, where to this day, very good reasons, Americans, all Americans, not just Indians, all Americans venerate these patriot chiefs, the heroic resistance fighters, even if their campaigns were futile. But many other Indian leaders considered discretion the better part of valor, sometimes later in their own lives. Perhaps when they were younger men, they advocated armed resistance. And as they got older, they advocated accommodation. Or they advocated some mixed strategy of accommodation and passive resistance. They did so not because they were cowards, not because they were treacherous, but because to them, that was the best way to safeguard the interests of their people and future generations. Unfortunately, the patriot chief narrative has been unkind to such men and women, even if subsequent events, I think, oftentimes vindicate the courses of action that they pursued. Eventually, nearly all American Indians resigned themselves to life on the reservation, where they did what they could to preserve their culture under conditions of wrenching social change. In the gendered spheres of most Indian communities, women had the easier go of it. Keepers of the hearth and horticulturalists, rearers of children to begin with, they could carry on the reservation much as they had for generations before. For Indian men, however, the change was more dramatic, more wrenching. Traditionally, they had served in these complementary capacities as hunters and warriors. But in the reservation era, the U.S. government discouraged hunting and forbade intertribal warfare, leaving young men in particular with few prospects for distinction or fundamentally for self-actualization. It's not surprising then that many young men in the reservation era would grasp opportunities to serve either as reservation policemen or as auxiliaries to the U.S. Army, Indian Scouts. Not unfairly, many Americans, both at the time and subsequently, scholars and contemporary observers at the time, criticized this exploitation of the Indians' vulnerable condition. And it's true that American officers wielding these Indian auxiliaries often did think that they were turning the Indians against their own kind, that they were pitting them against one another. Perhaps the most effective of these American commanders is pictured here in the top left, General George Crook. And if you see the movie Geronimo, that's the character that's portrayed by Gene Hackman in the movie. Crook General George Crook. And if you see the movie Geronimo, that's the character that's portrayed by Gene Hackman in the movie. Crook, honestly, sincerely, had a genuine humanitarian concern for the Indians. Indeed, if you've seen the PBS series, We Shall Remain, the American Experience, so you can watch the whole thing online. I highly recommend it to you. It's a native produced and directed and assembled series that looks at a bunch of different chapters of Native American history. The chapter on Geronimo, present-day Apaches are very ambivalent about Geronimo, whether he was a good guy or a bad guy. Most of the testimony in that episode, most of them thought Crook was a pretty good guy. Crook is actually a very good, from a pragmatic point of view, a very effective wielder of Indian auxiliaries. And he said, nothing polishes a diamond more effectively than its own dust. So he's the good guy, all things considered, and he does see this as pitting Indians against their own kind. So that's a fair criticism. It's less fair to assume, however, that the Indians were merely dupes, being exploited and manipulated by their colonizers. In many instances, they fought not against fellow Indians, but against their mortal enemies. What Dances with Wolves does not show you is the earlier chapters of Pawnee and Lakota history, when the Lakotas waged ruthless, predatory war on their weaker and more sedentary Pawnee neighbors. These scouts depicted in Dances with Wolves, then, aren't merely seeking gainful employment. They're not merely fulfilling their mere gender roles. They are revisiting upon the Lakotas favors dealt to them in the past, serving their interests as best they can. In other instances, the Army truly did pit Indians against their own kind, by which I mean not Indians in general, because a pan-Indian identity is slow to take form and to have general applicability. But I'm talking about being pitted against their own tribe or clan, as when George Crook employed the Apaches in his campaign against Geronimo. In these instances, Indians did what they had always done under similar circumstances. I'm referring again to pulling their punches, avoiding pitched confrontations, and opening channels of communication to enable compromise and negotiation that would not have existed absent their participation in these affairs. The government certainly did not always reward these Indian scouts' services as it should have. But later generations of Americans, we should not compound this injustice by painting the history of those scouts in dark strokes. As they had for centuries, these Indians played the hand that they were dealt as best they could, and in a manner befitting their interests, their experience, and their culture. They had few good cards by the end of the 19th century, but they did whatever they could within their means at their disposal to look after their people. Of a patriot, we can expect no more. Thank you. If you want to know the rest of the story, I do have a box of the book. This is more about the Blackhawk course. Like I said, the talk, I borrowed parts of the book for the talk, but this is more tightly on Indian allies in the Blackhawk.
How much is that?
It's a one night only special, $25. If you want to know off of Amazon, it's $32. So I have to undersell Amazon because otherwise I know I go to these things. I'll look it up and I'm going to buy it off of Amazon. So I'll undersell Amazon here than $25. Sir?
What's the significance of a female with Crook?
That's actually not a female. It's a rather distinguished looking gentleman.
Okay.
Are there any other questions?
What years was that when Crook was...
Crook's campaigns against the Apaches, I think these are all pictures from the 1880s. I'm not 100% positive on the actual year. I teach, you're at the point of the semester, but I only have so much space up here, and so I'm at the point of the semester where I've just finished teaching all of the early stuff, where I am right now teaching this kind of material to the undergraduates. I am right now, I've just finished doing Lexington and Concord, and Bunker Hill, the Battle of Long Island. We're midpoint of the American Revolution, so any questions that you ask me that predate the American Revolution, I can answer with perfection. If it's later than the Black Hawk War, I'm going to give you fuzzy answers.
I was going to make him talk a little bit about, I think we all here know who John Kinsey is, right? And John Kinsey came up in his book a little bit, and I was asking him before this started what he found out about John Kinsey. If you wanted to talk about that. That's interesting.
Well, what I can tell you about John Kinsey, the interesting thing is, so there's a split relationship within the War Department in terms of who's managing Indian affairs. So at nearly every place, there is a military post and there is an Indian agency house. If the Indian agency, the post of agent is vacant, the Army officer, the command of the post usually picks up responsibility for being the person in charge of Indian affairs. But generally speaking, the agent handles all of the day-to-day things, and there are separate channels of communication that go up. In a modern organization, this would be regarded as woefully ineffective, inefficient, and indeed dysfunctional. Those channels, they're sitting side by side, essentially, and their chains of command only unite in the Secretary of War himself. And so that's how far up communication, which is not to say there's not informal collaboration going on between the two of them. But Kinsey, to me, is very interesting because he is, more so than any of the other Indian agents in this story, in this region during the Blackhawk War, an agent who is actively working to subvert federal policy. He has connections to the American Fur Company. He had worked for the American Fur Company. I think he's still actually on the payroll of the American Fur Company. His family is an American Fur Company family. Remember how I described the federal policy at the time, the civilization policy. Turn them into small plot agriculturalists. They'll abandon war. They'll need less land. We can settle everything. The American Fur Company does not want the Indians to become farmers. The American Fur Company likes the way things are. The American Fur Company likes the contested zones. The American Fur Company, I don't want to give John Kinsey too much credit, but there is another interesting thing. He deliberately subverts Henry Atkinson's efforts to bring the Menominees of Green Bay into the war. It's the Green Bay Menominees are the ones who have been pleading most emphatically to join this war from the beginning. They're the ones that Atkinson had deployed to prevent going to war. They're the ones that want revenge for this most recent attack outside of Prairie du Chien, but they're way up in Green Bay, and they're faithful allies. So they're not happy at all, but they listen to the government. They're going to wait, and finally, it's not until after a series of disasters and reverses that Atkinson gradually starts accepting Indian allies. That's another thing that's often overlooked when it comes to the Americans exploiting intertribal divisions. More often, I'd say it's fair to say it's the Indians exploiting American incompetence when it comes to these kinds of things. The government and public opinion is against employing Indian allies because it runs completely counter to the civilization program. For some people, it also suggests exactly what I said it suggests, and that is a relationship between sovereigns. And some people just don't want the government to continue to deal with Indians on an equal footing, and they think that if you treat Indians as military allies, that's going to do that, and it's going to delay the inevitable point in time in the future when they're just going to become second-class citizens, which is what most Anglo-Americans on the frontier are looking for. So the call for Indian allies comes very late, relatively late, and the Menominees in Green Bay are among the last to get the call. And Kinsey, sitting here, does not want the Menominees to go to war. And I haven't been able to figure out exactly why, but I suspect it is because the American Fur Company is savvy enough to see what's going to happen if this war ends the way it actually does end, which is to say the Sauks and the Squawkies are going to be vanquished, stability is going to return to the region, there is going to be a massive influx of settlers into Wisconsin, and Wisconsin is no longer going to be profitable. Not that it's really profitable by the time of the Blackhawk War anyways, but this is all sort of an inexorable process. The longer they can uphold that kind of buffer frontier, the better it suits the interests of the American Fur Company. So Kinsey's not only the Indian agent here, he's also the postmaster. And so he gets mail from Atkinson calling for these Indian allies. He sits on it because he does not want Menominee allies to enter the war. And then when the Menominees come down, all of the Ho-Chunks, because this area turns into essentially a Ho-Chunk refugee camp during the Blackhawk War. Interestingly, the Ho-Chunks traditionally regarded to be the most hierarchical of all the tribes in the region. The Ho-Chunks actually they still recognized a paramount chief. None of the other tribes recognized a paramount chief, but they nominally recognized a paramount chief. What had happened, though, as the Saukes and Meskwakis got kicked out of the region, the Ho-Chunks expanded to fill all of the terrain they left, and as they became more diffuse, political power sort of went with them. And so all politics became local, which is the way it is in most Indian societies. It became increasingly so for the Ho-Chunks, and so it's very difficult to generalize Ho-Chunk alignment during the Blackhawk War. Some of the Ho-Chunks were fully in the Dakota and Menominee camp and went to war against the Saukes and Meskwakis, spilled Sauk and Meskwaki blood, suffered retaliatory attacks from the Saukes and Meskwakis afterward because of it. So there were Ho-Chunk allies in the United States. There were other pretend Ho-Chunk allies that I spoke of. There were Ho-Chunks who covertly allied with Blackhawk, and then most Ho-Chunks just tried to keep their distance. And those that wanted to keep their distance came up here. And the Ho-Chunk population around Fort Winnebago swelled during the Blackhawk War amongst those who wanted to maintain their neutrality. And I'm pretty certain that Kinsey was instigating. That Kinsey was making this a space friendly for Indians of those sympathies. And when the Menominees finally did come down from Green Bay and they passed through here, the Ho-Chunks were talking smack to them the whole way through, telling them they were going to get their clocks cleaned, you guys better turn around, and really discouraging the Menominees from entering the fray. And I don't think Kinsey had no role in that, because his attitude seems to align pretty closely to the Winnebagos that were here at the time. And of course, Kinsey was well liked by the Ho-Chunks. And Juliet Kinsey in Wabun refers to the Ho-Chunks of this agency as our own people, which again, kind of I think reinforces the point I made earlier about their developing loyalties between these relationships, if only at this functionary level. Not all agents are so good. Joseph Montfort Street at Prairie du Chien, a bombastic pain in the butt. Indians can't stand him. Not surprisingly, he keeps his job. He's there before Jackson becomes the president, and he keeps his job because he is a steadfast advocate of the civilization program, and he does everything he can to implement it.
Any other questions?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, tell me about the pictures. What tribes are those?
I'm gonna have to put up older pictures. These are all Apaches. These are all Crooks Apache Scouts, and so the Apache Scouts are some of the more famous instances because for several reasons. There is only one recorded instance of U.S. Army Indian Scouts, and when I say Scouts, I'm talking about auxiliaries. And so I try to draw a spectrum here with three different kind of types. There's the traditional alliance, which is a relationship between sovereigns. Blackhawk War is one of the last times you see something that really kind of looks like that, because Indian power is fading fast enough that afterward you're going to see something that is more along the line of the Ho-Chunk and Potawatomi alliance, which is not so much a relationship between sovereigns, but neither are those Indian groups admitting that they are subjects. They're trying to stay in the good graces of what they regard then as a paramount chiefdom. Essentially, they are admitting they are tributaries of that power. The third and final phase is the point where nobody can maintain the fiction anymore, and they have to accommodate the world that they actually live in, and they are willing to actually be auxiliaries or scouts where they fight under the command of white officers. The Apaches were among the most effective, but they also had the one single black eye, the only time in which those scouts or auxiliaries fired upon U.S. troops. Those were Apaches that did it. And I don't remember the year, and I don't remember the exact place, but I think that it was in New Mexico, if I'm not mistaken. And of course, this led to huge outrage. I mean, you see in the news today what happens when Afghani security forces being trained by the U.S. turn and fire on their trainers. That's happened relatively frequently in Afghanistan, more often than the government cares to admit. Only once did that ever happen there. Sir.
Would you say the most rapid change in Wisconsin was after the Blackhawk War that basically pretty much ended the Indian Wars, and I think that allowed a lot more settlement and thus ended pretty much the fur trade also?
It did. I say that we tend to compartmentalize everything by the American Revolution and the U.S. Constitution. Everything that's before the Revolution we call the colonial era. As it pertains to Wisconsin history, the colonial era ends with the Blackhawk War. This is a colonial. When Secretary of War Lewis, no, I'm sorry, he is Secretary of War during the Blackhawk War, but the vignette that I'm going to share with you, he's the governor of Michigan Territory at this time. When he is out here traveling, doing treaties with the Indians, he's in a birch bark canoe with French voyageurs paddling and singing songs in French. That's how the governor of Michigan Territory is getting from point A to point B. This is a colonial space until the conclusion of the Blackhawk War. The Blackhawk War removes the last stops that are holding up that world. Blackhawk, incidentally, is still hoping to capitalize on the playoff system. He's got the forlorn hope that he can still induce the British to resurrect that old alliance, and so he's got envoys heading off to Canada. And I say he's got envoys. Technically, the envoy outranks him. He's a legitimate civil chief, whereas Blackhawk is merely an established war leader. But the Pope comes back and says, "Yeah, the Brits have our backs." At least that's the way the story goes. That's the way Blackhawk presents it, because it makes it seem as if he was betrayed or misled. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Well, let's hear about the book. A little more about the book.
Well, the book is, if I tell people it's not a book about the Blackhawk War, and just earlier I said this book most about the Blackhawk War, but what I tried to name the book, what I tried to title the book when I finished it was the subtitle, rather. The way that you title books is you got something sexy for the title, and then something actually describes the book as the subtitle. And so the subtitle I wanted was Indian Alliance Politics in the Western Great Lakes after the War of 1812. I don't know why my publisher did not like that subtitle, but in terms of accurately describing what the book is about, that's what it is about. And so the initial chapters describe in kind of a big picture sweep the history of Indian-European alliances in this region up through the War of 1812, and it enables you as the reader to empathize with the Indians of this region. Because again, in hindsight, you look, are these people just stupid? Jackson's the president, Indian Removal Act has been passed, and you're going to ally with the United States against other Indians? It only looks that way in retrospect from where we stand. If you position yourself in Wisconsin in 1816, in 1822, and in 1832, everything that those groups did made perfect sense within the confines of what they knew and what options were available to them. And so the first several chapters enable you to empathize with those Indians, and then for the rest of the book, I essentially follow the paths of the several different contingents of Indians that participate in the war. And so that's just a big general overview of the sweep of the conflict. Perhaps the better slide in terms of showing what the book actually talks about is how these contingents were actually raised and what they did over the course of the war. So from chapter 5 onward, it's more of a narrative history in terms of it actually follows these Indian warriors through the war and describes what they did, and at the end the legacy. Because the sad fact is all of these groups did what made sense under the circumstances, but ultimately they helped stabilize the region and enable those stops to be pulled and open up the state to white settlement. And so the Ho-Chunks were removed from Wisconsin soon thereafter. The Dakotas remained a powerful sovereign entity for years to come. It's not until the Sioux Uprising, so-called, of 1862, that the reckoning for the Dakotas comes. So you can see how long the Dakotas are actually able to retain some degree of power. But I describe that sad transition from ally to victim to enemy, and usually victim to enemy, that transition doesn't occur until it's too late for them to actually resist by force groups, and that's the case then for the Dakota in 1862. So I hint at that a little bit at the end of the book, but the book more or less ends in the 1840s with the removal of the Potawatomis from northern Illinois and with the removal of the Ho-Chunks from Wisconsin. The Menominees are the only ones that I think you could say come out of this more or less with their best interests still intact. It's not coincidental that they're the only group that maintained a Wisconsin homeland. The Ho-Chunks reestablished one over time, but they did so by rather unconventional means, taking advantage of the Homestead Act to actually claim homesteads in Wisconsin, and were able to reestablish a land base here that way. Sir?
I guess ironically, what I find huge irony that so many of the Native Americans were escaping from the Iroquois, and what happened with many of the reservations here in Wisconsin are
well, it's in Oneida and in other groups. Of the different Iroquois tribes, I described the Mohawks as being those most steadfastly against the Americans. Their next door neighbors, the Oneidas, were America's most dependable Indian allies during the American Revolution, and that's a much longer story. But those Oneidas that were transplanted here in 1822, I think, actually had been allies of the United States since the founding of the Republic. And there are Indian groups that have always been nothing but allies of the United States, that have never went through that transition. Essentially, they chose that path of accommodation early and made the best of it. And that's why I say, in hindsight, a lot of times I think you could say that the course of some of those leaders who chose discretion over valor, that subsequent events vindicated their courses of action. In some cases, it did serve their people's interest better. Not to diminish the justice of the cause of the traditional patriot chiefs.
I'm going to cut people off now, sorry. I think I'll be here to answer some questions afterwards if you'd like to approach him individually. So I guess thank you for joining us this year. If you've been here before, you know the donation box is where? Buy the food. Yeah. So if you want to hit that around, that'd be great. Hope you'll join us next year for a lecture series. We do have one more public event. It's a Christmas party in December. We have a Kitty Christmas, December 7th, which is free to the public. And we have sort of a mixer silent auction fundraiser, Christmas at the Kinseys, here the next night on the 8th. If you're interested in those celebrations, stop by front desk. Bobby can maybe give you our events calendar, and it has the dates on there. And if you want to get on our mailing list once again, we have a sign-up sheet. So enjoy the rest of your year, and thank you for coming. Oh, look at the pink sheets.